What happens when a beloved British acting legend sits down for what should be a friendly chat about his latest film, only to find himself under attack from a talk show host who seems determined to tear him down? In just 34 seconds, one reckless comment would transform a respected television presenter into the most hated woman in Britain and send shockwaves through the entertainment industry that are still being felt today. Michael Caine adjusted his tie as he settled into the bright orange sofa of the Loose Women's studio. The legendary actor, known for his roles in countless films, from The Italian Job to The Dark Knight, had agreed to appear on the popular daytime show to promote his new autobiography. What should have been a pleasant 20-minute chat was about to become one of the most explosive moments in British television history. The studio audience applauded warmly as the cameras rolled live across the nation. Sitting opposite Michael were the four panelists. Denise Welch, the outspoken former Coronation Street actress who had made a name for herself with controversial opinions. Ruth Langford, the seasoned presenter trying to keep things professional, Colleen Nolan, nervously fidgeting with her notes, and Jane Moore, who seemed to sense the tension building in the air. "So, Michael," Denise began with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "your new book talks about your humble beginnings. You grew up poor in South London, didn't you?" Michael nodded graciously. "That's right, Denise. My father worked in a fish market, and my mother cleaned houses. We didn't have much, but we had love and respect for one another. Those values shaped who I became." "How inspiring," Ruth chimed in supportively. "And look where you are now, a true rags to riches story." But Denise wasn't finished. Her tone shifted slightly, becoming more pointed. "Yes, but some might say you've forgotten where you came from, living in your mansion. Haven't you become part of the elite you once looked up at from below?" The question caught Michael off guard, but he maintained his composure. "I've never forgotten my roots, Denise. Success doesn't change who you are inside. I still remember what it was like to go hungry as a child." "Oh, please," Denise scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "You live in a multi-million-pound house now. You probably spend more on a bottle of wine than most people earn in a month. How can you possibly relate to ordinary working people anymore?" The studio fell silent. Jane Moore shifted uncomfortably in her seat while Colleen looked mortified. Ruth tried to intervene. "Denise, I think what Michael is trying to say is that success hasn't changed his values." But Denise was just getting started. She leaned forward aggressively, pointing her finger at the veteran actor. "Values? What values? You moved to America for tax reasons, didn't you? Running away from paying your fair share while ordinary British families struggle to put food on the table." Michael's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm and measured. "I moved to America for work opportunities, Denise, and I've always paid every penny of tax that I owe wherever I've lived. I resent the implication that I've somehow cheated the system." "Resent it all you like," Denise shot back, her voice rising. "The fact remains that while you are living it up in Hollywood, real people back home were suffering through austerity. But I suppose that doesn't matter when you're dining with movie stars and politicians." The audience began to murmur disapprovingly. Several people could be heard making comments about Denise's behavior, but she seemed oblivious to the growing hostility in the room. Jane Moore finally spoke up, her voice tight with embarrassment. "Denise, I think we should focus on Michael's incredible career achievements rather than his personal finances." But Michael raised his hand gently. "No, it's all right, Jane. I'm happy to address this." He turned to face Denise directly, his famous voice taking on a steelier edge. "I've worked for over 60 years in this business, Denise. I've created jobs for thousands of people, contributed millions in taxes, and supported numerous charities. If that makes me elite, then I'm proud to be elite," Denise laughed mockingly. "There it is. The mask slips. You admit you're better than the rest of us." "I never said that," Michael replied firmly. "But I won't be lectured about my character by someone who clearly doesn't know the first thing about me or my life." The tension in the studio was now palpable. Ruth attempted damage control. "Perhaps we could talk about your new film projects, Michael. I understand you have several exciting things in the pipeline." But Denise wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by the confrontation. "Oh, yes. Let's talk about your projects. Another film where you play a wise old mentor figure, I suppose. Don't you think it's time to step aside and let younger actors have a chance? Colleen gasped audibly. Even she, known for her diplomatic nature, looked shocked at the personal attack. The audience's disapproval was now clearly audible. With several people calling out in Michael's defense, Michael's composure finally began to crack. Younger actors, Denise, I've been supporting younger actors throughout my entire career. I've mentored dozens of performers who went on to become stars themselves. What exactly have you done to help the next generation? I don't need to justify myself to you, Denise snapped. But at least I'm honest about who I am. I don't pretend to be some working-class hero while living in luxury. And I don't pretend to be a journalist while conducting ambush interviews, Michael fired back, his voice rising for the first time. This was supposed to be about my book, not a character assassination. Ruth desperately tried to regain control. Let's all take a breath here and get back to the book. But Denise was on a roll now, seemingly intoxicated by the drama she had created. She stood up slightly from her chair, pointing accusingly at Michael. Character assassination? I'm just asking the questions that real people want answered. Why should we celebrate someone who abandoned Britain the moment it suited him? Abandoned Britain? Michael's eyes flashed with anger. I've represented Britain around the world for decades. I've been an ambassador for British cinema and British values everywhere I've gone. How dare you question my loyalty to my country? The audience erupted in supportive applause for Michael, but Denise seemed to interpret this as encouragement to continue her attack. Oh, listen to them clapping, Denise said with a bitter laugh, gesturing dismissively at the audience. They're so easily impressed by a posh accent and a few old films. But I'm not buying it, Michael. I see right through this act. Michael's face darkened. The veteran actor who had faced down some of Hollywood's toughest directors and most challenging roles was clearly struggling to contain his growing fury. Act. This isn't an act, Denise. This is who I am. A working man who made something of himself through hard work and determination. Working man? Denise practically shrieked, her voice becoming shrill and grating. You haven't done a real day's work in decades. Standing in front of cameras and reading lines isn't work. Real work is what nurses do, what teachers do, what shop assistants do. You just play pretend for millions of pounds. Jane Moore couldn't stay silent any longer. Denise, that's completely unfair. Acting is a legitimate profession that requires enormous skill and dedication. Don't defend him, Jane, Denise snapped, turning her venom toward her colleague. You're all so starstruck you can't see what's right in front of you. This man represents everything that's wrong with our society, the rich getting richer while the poor get poorer. Colleen finally found her voice, speaking softly but firmly. Michael has always been gracious in every interview I've ever seen. He's a gentleman and a professional. This is completely out of line. Out of line? Denise whirled around to face Colleen, her eyes blazing with indignation. What's out of line is pretending that celebrities like him deserve our respect just because they're famous. I'm asking the hard questions that nobody else has the guts to ask. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying Denise with the calculating gaze of someone who had dealt with difficult people throughout his long career. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. I think I understand what this is really about, Denise. This isn't about my tax affairs or where I choose to live. This is about your own insecurities. My insecurities? Denise laughed harshly. That's rich coming from someone who spent his whole life pretending to be other people because he can't face being himself. The studio audience was now openly hostile toward Denise. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone!" while others made disapproving noises, but rather than backing down, Denise seemed to feed off the negative energy. You want to know what I think? She continued, her voice rising to almost a shout. I think you're a fraud, Michael Caine. I think you've been coasting on your reputation for years, taking roles from more deserving actors, living off past glories while contributing nothing meaningful to society. Ruth Langford looked absolutely mortified as the senior presenter. She knew this interview was spiraling completely out of control, but Denise had gone so far beyond acceptable behavior that normal damage control seemed impossible. Denise, please, let's try to keep this professional. Professional? Denise rounded on Ruth now, her anger expanding to include, everyone who dared challenge her. What's professional about giving celebrities like him a free pass to spout their privileged nonsense? I'm being honest for once on this show. Instead of kissing up to every guest who walks through that door, Michael's patience finally reached its breaking point. He stood up slowly, his tall frame imposing even at his advanced age, and looked down at Denise with cold contempt. I've been in this business for over 60 years, young lady, and I've never encountered such unprofessional, disrespectful behavior from a television presenter. Your conduct is disgraceful. Don't you dare call me young lady, Denise snarled, jumping to her feet to face him. That's exactly the kind of condescending attitude I'm talking about. You think you can dismiss me because I'm a woman and I'm younger than you? I'm dismissing you because you're behaving like a spoiled child having a tantrum, Michael replied with icy precision. Age and gender have nothing to do with it. Your behavior would be unacceptable from anyone. The audience erupted in cheers and applause, clearly supporting Michael's response. Several people could be heard shouting agreements while others called for Denise to apologize, but she was beyond reason now, her face flushed with rage and embarrassment. A spoiled child? She screamed, pointing accusingly at Michael. You're calling me a spoiled child? You're the one who's had everything handed to you on a silver platter. You're the one who thinks the world owes you respect just because you're Michael Caine. Jane Moore tried desperately to intervene. Denise, you need to calm down. This is live television. Think about what you're saying, but Denise was too far gone to listen to reason. I don't care if it's live television. Someone needs to hold these so-called legends accountable for their arrogance and their selfishness. Someone needs to speak truth to power. Michael shook his head sadly, looking at Denise with something approaching pity. Truth to power? You're attacking a man who grew up with nothing, who worked his way up through sheer determination, who has employed thousands of people and entertained millions more. If you think that makes me the enemy, then you've lost all perspective. Lost perspective. Denise's voice cracked with hysteria. You live in a different world from the rest of us. You have no idea what real people go through. You sit in your ivory tower looking down on everyone else, and you expect us to be grateful for the privilege of your presence. Colleen was now visibly upset, tears forming in her eyes as she watched her colleague's complete breakdown. Denise, please stop. You're embarrassing yourself in the show. Embarrassing myself? Denise turned on Colleen with savage fury. The only thing embarrassing here is how you're all bowing and scraping to this has-been actor who probably doesn't even remember our names. That was the final straw for Michael. His famous composure, honed through decades of professional experience, finally cracked completely. Has been, he roared, his voice filling the studio with commanding authority. How dare you speak to me like that? I've achieved more in my career than you could dream of in 10 lifetimes. The entire studio fell silent except for the sound of Denise's heavy breathing. Even the camera crew seemed frozen by the intensity of the confrontation. Ruth, Jane, and Colleen sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how a simple book promotion had turned into such a vicious personal attack. For a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, the only sound in the studio was the quiet hum of the television cameras still rolling, capturing every second of this catastrophic interview for the nation to witness. Michael stood towering over the orange sofa, his chest rising and falling with barely controlled rage, while Denise stared up at him with wild eyes, seemingly shocked that someone had finally stood up to her relentless assault. The silence was broken by a single voice from the audience. "Good on you, Michael!" shouted an elderly woman near the front, and suddenly the entire studio erupted in thunderous applause. The audience rose to their feet, as one clapping and cheering for the legendary actor who had finally put the aggressive presenter in her place. Several people could be heard calling out support. "She's out of order, and leave the man alone," filled the air. But rather than retreating in the face of such overwhelming disapproval, Denise doubled down on her attack with a venomous smile. Oh, how touching. The great Michael Caine loses his temper, and suddenly he's the hero. Well, I'm not impressed by your little outburst. If anything, it proves my point about your arrogance. Michael's eyes narrowed dangerously. My arrogance? You spent the last 15 minutes hurling insults at me, questioning my integrity, attacking. My character, and calling me names, and you have the nerve to talk about my arrogance. I've been asking legitimate questions, Denise shot back, though her voice wavered slightly as she realized how isolated she had become. Questions that your adoring fans don't want to hear because they'd rather worship at the altar of celebrity than face uncomfortable truths. Ruth Langford made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Perhaps we should take a commercial break and everyone can cool down. No, Michael said firmly, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade. I won't be taking a break. I came here as a guest on your show, expecting to be treated with basic courtesy and respect. Instead, I've been subjected to a sustained personal attack by someone who clearly has her own agenda. Denise laughed bitterly. My agenda? My agenda is holding people like you accountable. My agenda is not letting celebrities think they can waltz onto our show and expect to be fawned over without answering hard questions. Hard questions? Michael's voice dripped with contempt. You haven't asked a single hard question. You've made accusations, hurled insults, and conducted yourself like a tabloid journalist looking for a sensational headline. There's nothing professional or legitimate about your behavior. The audience roared its approval, but Denise pressed on with reckless determination. At least I'm honest about what I'm doing. I'm not hiding behind a carefully crafted public image like some people. I say what I think. And if that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe they need to examine why. Jane Moore finally exploded with frustration. Denise, you're not being honest. You're being cruel and unprofessional. Michael came here to talk about his book, and you've turned it into a character assassination. Stay out of this, Jane, Denise snapped viciously. You're just as starstruck as the rest of them. You can't see past the fame to the real man underneath. Caine, who had been quietly crying throughout the confrontation, finally found her voice. The real man underneath is a gentleman who's been nothing but gracious despite your appalling behavior. You should be ashamed of yourself. Ashamed? Denise whirled around to face her tearful colleague. I should be ashamed for doing my job, for asking the questions that matter, for not being intimidated by his reputation. Michael had heard enough. With a dignity that had made him one of Britain's most respected actors, he began removing his microphone with deliberate, measured movements. I've been in this business for over 6 decades, he said, his voice now calm but filled with steel. I've worked with the greatest directors, the most talented actors, and the most professional broadcasters in the world. But I have never ever encountered such disgraceful conduct from a television presenter. The studio fell silent again, everyone recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. A beloved national treasure was about to walk away from a live television interview, something that simply didn't happen in the polite world of British daytime television. Denise seemed to realize she had pushed too far, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. Fine, walk away, she said with false bravado. That's what people like you do when faced with real questions. You run back to your comfortable bubble where everyone tells you how wonderful you are. Michael paused in removing his microphone and looked at her with something approaching pity. Real questions. You want to know what a real question would be? A real question would be about my 60-year career, about the films I've made, about the book I came here to discuss. A real question would show some preparation, some knowledge, some basic respect for your guest and your audience. He finished removing the microphone and placed it carefully on the coffee table. But you're not interested in real questions, are you, Denise? You're interested in creating drama, in making headlines, in putting on a show for the cameras. Well, congratulations, you've succeeded. But you've also shown everyone exactly who you are. The audience began applauding again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the excited cheering from before, but rather a slow, respectful clap that acknowledged they were witnessing something profound and sad. A dignified man had been pushed beyond his limits by someone who seemed incapable of basic decency. Ruth, Jane, and Caine sat in stunned silence, knowing their show's reputation was being destroyed in real time. They could only watch helplessly as their colleagues' meltdown played out before millions of viewers. Don't you dare lecture me about who I am, Denise screamed, finally losing all pretense of control. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through? You think you can just dismiss me like some nobody? Michael straightened his jacket and looked at her with the weary expression of a man who had seen too much of human nature. I'm not dismissing you because you're a nobody, Denise. I'm dismissing you because of how you've chosen to behave today. You had the opportunity to conduct a meaningful interview with someone who has lived through the golden age of British cinema. Instead, you chose to turn it into a circus. With that, Michael Caine turned and walked toward the studio exit with the same grace and dignity he had brought to countless film roles over his remarkable career. The audience rose to their feet again, this time in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. As he reached the studio door, Michael paused and turned back one final time. Good luck with your show, ladies. You're going to need it. And with those words, one of Britain's greatest living actors walked out of the Loose Women studio, leaving behind a presenter whose career would never recover from 34 seconds of pure, unfiltered malice.